let's stay with you for a second there, David, and then let's go to the audience and ask for some questions. So, you know, there's two types of, or I'm going to arbitrarily divide viewability into two types of things. Viewability as in above the fold, below the fold, or not seen, but it's a real person on a real website, and you know, just a question of whether it was actually seen or whether someone was doing something else, versus someone's trying to stuff ads that will never be seen by anyone. So can you define the latter for me?
Sure.
You know, what are people doing out there on, you know, to try to get you to buy the wrong stuff, versus, at least from my point of view, that, you know, that other version of viewability is much less a problem, because you can, you know, maybe you can figure out how many people will tab to the bottom of a page, and maybe it's worth 20% of what the thing at the top of the page is. But if it's never going to be seen, well, that's worth 0. So
yeah, sure, I can certainly do that. Before that, I'll give you a little anecdote, is that we actually see higher viewability rates on certain types of sites and ads that are positioned at the bottom of the page and the top of the page. So in our minds, where the ad is positioned on the page, the notion of above the fold, below the fold is actually an old school newspaper term, where there was a fold.
Right.
There's different pages now, they're different sizes. There's you know, unlimited scrolling, there's fixed scroll, there's mobile
What about
devices.
those ads that when I try to close it, it follows my mouse around?
Those are the only ones that come up on your network.
But ding! Nice.
For the press, that was a joke.
And since we're a publisher, it must have been generated by one of these guys.
So in our minds, you know, viewability is really irrelevant on where the ad is placed on the page. It's really, does the user engage with that piece of the page where the ad is served? On the fraud side, we define fraud, and the industry is really rallying around this with the Traffic of Good Intent Task Force to actually specifically identify ads that have absolutely no potential of ever being seen by a human. Now, I think that there are a lot of buyers in this room, and I'm pretty sure that if I said, who of you actually care about whether your ads are seen by humans or not, please raise your hands, and please all of you raise your hands.
Let's try that. Let's try it. It's a survey. Who cares here whether their ads are seen by anybody?
All right. So
does anyone not care? There you go.
Okay.
Some
good.
networks.
You know what?
What was that?
I said some networks.
Let's try that.
Wait a minute.
Let's try that.
Some of the attribution.
Someone's going to put their hand up.
No, I was going to say, who here is from a network?
It actually
I like
is.
to steal.
Some of the attribution things that I think people are using for modeling attribution actually care more about the attribution KPI than they do whether or not it was viewed.
Yeah. So we have a joke internally. We say, you know, every morning the rooster comes out when the sun comes up. Now, does the sun cause the rooster to come out, or does the rooster cause the sun to come up, right? Attribution today is highly, highly correlation-driven. It's rules-based, and maybe there are a lot of more sophisticated models. In fact, we know there are a lot of more sophisticated models in the ecosystem, but the way publishers are being rewarded primarily is through rules-based attribution metrics in ad servers, click-through, view-through, et cetera, et cetera. That incentivizes people to commit fraud, because what happens is you can, for $20, you know, register a domain, go and buy some content, generate that content, create a cookie pool, go out and buy some traffic, and all of a sudden you're generating 1 million impressions a day and you're getting paid for that. So for us, fraud is non-human traffic, in other words, bots, botnets, robots, etc., or impressions that never have an opportunity of being viewed. In our example, you know, framing CNN.com into a 1x1 iframe on my blog. CNN gets a lot of traffic, and that'll give me a lot of ad reps.
Right.
You don't have to, though, take that traffic if you see it in an exchange or in RTB. And I think that's one of the things that comScore has done for the history of comScore, is to be that arbiter of understanding what's actually legitimate. And by having the panel, we are actually able to see that no one ever goes to that site. And we've definitely seen that in RTB and have clients who are using it to say, wow, there's this site in RTB that's generating all this amazing traffic, volumes and volumes of traffic. And then they go look in comScore and it doesn't exist. Site doesn't have any traffic because no real panelists actually ever go there. So there are ways to discern that kind of false generated traffic from what humans do. And it really takes a combination of both those technical solutions and tagging solutions that we employ, but also having some measure of what a human actually does. Putting those together and you get a really good solution.
I think that's certainly true for when you're doing buying in monthly or quarterly increments, right? The panel takes time to actually collect its data and produce the data, and we certainly don't negate the value of the panels. But what we're seeing with fraud, like you look at the Chameleon botnet or the Zeus botnet, these things spring up and down in hours. And the minute you shut them down, 2 hours later, they're back up and running somewhere else. The only way in our minds to detect fraud, and it's certainly worse in the RTB environment than in other environments, is to do it in real time and to be able to leverage the power of the data at the time that the impression is being served to make a decision. And the panels certainly provide you with insights or forward-looking possibilities to do that. But when you're running X number of billion impressions a month through RTB across sites that are springing up and down daily, it's very hard to use a panel to make those decisions.
I think we have clients who would disagree
Let's
with
have,
that.
let's have Brian
wanna
weigh in
They,
here.
they automate the panel data into their decision making.
I think there's 3 points that I want to address. Number one is with viewability, as a buyer for Group M, and you said it, we still are currently the number one. You'll see that we are not going to pay for non-viewed impressions, as defined by David, what you just explained. So that'll happen as of January to put the line in the sand, because that's our advertisers' expectations. And we can all speak in this room about what we expect, but if you're the individual who's writing that check, your anticipation is, of course, it would be viewed and not be fraudulent traffic.
Right.
The second point of that, to David's point is, even though they're out of that 64 million, they are extremely sophisticated sites that are making hundreds of millions of dollars each and every day off of fraudulent traffic. And you see examples of that. And they can game the system. The challenge is we allow it. As a network, which I ran before, we're all challenged by a revenue number. And when you look at that every day and you see a site that's performing above expectations, it can't be the system that tells you, right? That's a valuable. There has to be a light bulb that goes off and says, ding, 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 in real time, they're robbing from you. Yeah. And then there has to be an individual who makes a choice. Yeah. Until we empower the individuals, and to credit Federated, that came from John Patel, who has a editorial background, right, and the integrity to make those choices. Within our community with over 300 networks, unfortunately, there are a lot who do not do that. Yep. And as margin constrictions become greater and greater, the problem will only be greater and greater until we eliminate it, until we use the tools that are available to us, until we tell our advertisers we will not pay for it, right? And until we eliminate the greed from these sophisticated outlets out there by making these choices. So
this is a sort of a turning point in the panel. So we've defined RTB, we've defined viewability. From this point on, we're going to talk about what we're going to do about it.
But we went out and we do an analysis pre, during, and post ad. So we filter. We do it during the actual ad request into the exchange, and then we do a post analysis, and we use vendors for some of this stuff, right, to make sure there's no malware injected. And they're not all ad safe. We use multiple. But when we found stuff that we said not fraudulent, but was suspicious of being fraudulent, and we turn it off, and it happens instantly, right? So we have guys that are on staff 24/7 looking at this stuff, and it comes through another network or exchange like that.
It's like whack-a-mole.
It is. Yeah. And it's all the big guys you know of, right?
And they arb to one another.
Right. Yeah. So, this is like, John goes, we're doing all this stuff, right, to hammer this out, and all it's doing is hurting our publishers' revenue, right? Yeah. But you shouldn't, the only way to make that, to get people to align, is to say, I'm not going to spend unless that stuff is, I know what it is. So regardless of what these guys answer. Right?
I think there's another interesting segue on that, right? And I totally agree with what you're saying, but just to answer your question, there's been a ton of progress made in the last 12, 18 months on viewability technology. I can speak for ourselves and a lot of the other vendors that are in this space, is that we're measuring impressions on about 90% of the available total. So the actual measured rates are around 90, 95% now, which is an almost census-based measurement. And it's available, from our system at least, in real time when the impressions are serving.
And to interrupt and add to that, 12 months ago, I don't know that it was available pre-bid from anyone, right? And now it is available.
Yeah, and I think as far as I know, we're the only people doing it pre-bid right now. In the
whether you are the only or not, it was not available when you did your test. Yeah, it wasn't available. Months ago. Yeah. So the whole ecosystem moves so fast.
Yeah, I would agree that there have been a lot of changes. One of the ones that is particularly interesting is the MRC accreditation process. In that time, there have been, in the past 12 months, there's been about 6 companies that have gone through the MRC accreditation process to have their viewable impressions accredited. And as part of that, they must disclose when an impression really can be measured and when an impression can't. And the MRC has been really clear in saying, if you can't measure it, you need to be honest with the buyer and you need to tell them and show them right. So if you're dealing with a company that's MRC accredited, you're going to get that information pre-campaign, you're going to get that information during the campaign in real time at an impression level. And we're giving that information through an impression level report every day to a client. So they have that information on every single impression that's served. That's something that now there's 6 companies in the market, so it's not only comScore that's MRC accredited, but you should only be working with an MRC accredited company if you want that level of comfort.
We're evaluating it now because if you're going to say we're not going to pay based off of this, there has to be a level of measurement. And where I know we're going to get to payment in that. But I think where the visibility, just from a buyer's perspective, it has to come down to, let's face it, the publisher direct relationship is much easier to manage than it is an aggregated model through a network. And I think it's incumbent upon the networks to be able to self-police in some ways.
Yep.
If not, that traffic, if it's available, or that inventory, if it's available on the exchange, and I have tools in place to be able to measure them that sit within my building, and I have a pool of 60 plus analysts to analyze that data every day, that gives me the advantage as a buyer, right?
Yep.
Where it's going to only hurt and put, I think, networks who put this type of traffic, and again, neither of them, anybody represented here today does that, but they're going to bring down the whole.
Yeah.
Because you'll go directly to the inventory source and the aggregation model will not, unless you have owned and operated inventory that is different from what I can buy on the open market.